Milky Way photography is part of the genre of astrophotography with a focus on shooting the Milky Way core. There are many factors that go into deciding on your camera settings, but overall, the most important part of shooting the Milky Way is planning. Everything revolves around being in the right place at the right time, especially when you're traveling somewhere to shoot it. Luckily, through the magic of modern technology, we can predict the exact time and placement of the Milky Way core on a minute-by-minute basis, and apps like Photopills even use AR technology to preview a composition on your phone. In the Northern Hemisphere, the general window of time that the Milky Way is visible is between March and October. At different times of the year, the core will rise earlier or later in the evening. For example, from March until June, it reaches its highest point at the end of the night, just before the blue hour when astronomical twilight begins. While most people know dusk or twilight as one phase of blue hour after the sun sets, it is actually divided into civil twilight, nautical twilight, and astronomical twilight, getting progressively darker in that order. Astronomical twilight bookends the true darkness of night on both sides, during which conditions are best for shooting the Milky Way. As the length of daytime changes throughout the year, so will the length of night. Summer overall is the best time for shooting the core, as it will already be at peak height by midnight. But the downside of shooting in June is that the summer solstice, which is the longest day of the year, falls on the 20th, and therefore the period of darkness can be as short as an hour and a half. While all these technical terms might take a while to fully understand, you're probably watching this video to learn how to shoot the Milky Way right now, and the easiest way to show this is by hopping on the Photopills app for an example. Photopills is a feature-rich photography planning app, but for this tutorial, we'll go straight into the Planner tab. Here we see a close-up of Crater Lake in Oregon, where I last shot the Milky Way. This pin can be dropped anywhere on the world map, and the date can be changed to coincide with your visit to any location. If you scroll through the bar at the bottom, you'll see the specific times of sunset and twilight phases, as well as a visual representation of the Milky Way moving across the horizon. The circles represent the Milky Way core, and the two gray lines show the points at which it will be dark enough to be visible. This makes it simple to preview compositions even before you've left home. Additionally, you'll want to plan your Milky Way shoot around the phases of the moon. While the moonlight can help light your foreground, it can easily drown out the Milky Way too, so you'll generally want to shoot in the days before, during, or after the new moon. Luckily, Photopills has a feature for planning this in the Moon tab. Here you can input a date and location and see a very specific timeline for the moon set and rise, as well as the Milky Way's visibility. Weather plays a large part in getting great photos of the Milky Way and will be the most frustrating and unpredictable factor in your shoot. A stray line of clouds can easily ruin months of effort and sometimes long drives or hikes to locations because escaping light pollution will generally lead you to remote spots. General weather apps will help with this, as well as apps like Meteo Earth for cloud cover. The Dark Sky app will give you detailed info on whether a location is dark enough to avoid light pollution from nearby cities. So you've spent weeks planning, scouted, traveled, and finally arrived to your chosen location. Now it's time for the next technical challenge in getting your camera settings right. Let's go to Chris on location at Secret Beach on the Oregon coast for an example.
So when you're shooting the Milky Way, there's obviously a lot that goes into planning and making sure the Milky Way is present at the location that you're shooting, and understanding that it will shift throughout the night depending on how long it's visible at that time of year. But once you have your shot all lined up and the composition all picked out, you're going to want to shoot at least 7 exposures of the same composition. Even though you'll notice the Milky Way will shift as you take the 7 exposures, I'll show you how we use Sequator to align those images and pick the image that you want as a foreground, and it'll do all the aligning for you. So you take your 7 images, and the purpose of this is because depending on your ISO, depending on your camera, full frame or crop sensor, you'll have noise in the image, and a single image just won't do it as far as being able to remove the noise in post. The 7 images will be able to be stacked in Sequator, and you'll be able to remove noise that way, get a nice clean image. On this occasion, I'm using my 14mm 2.8 Rokinon for a full frame A7 III. And in addition to that, I'm using a 35mm Sigma 1.4. With the 1.4, I can actually take exposures as short as 10 seconds with ISO at 4000, which is very convenient when you want to get those stacks in and not have too long of an interval in between your 7 stacks. With the 14mm 2.8, I'm taking a 20-second exposure with ISO at 4000, 6400, or even 8000, depending on how dark the scene is. I'm kind of shooting a few to experiment because maybe the noise will be too great in the 8000 or 10,000 ISO. I'm not fully sure of the ISO tolerance of this A7 III. I know it has a dual level ISO, so so I will see how that works in post. But overall, you want to cover your ass and take a lot of photos at different settings and have a lot to work with in post, and to be able to clean that up in Photoshop.
To quickly summarize, you'll generally want the fastest, widest glass on the largest sensor camera you can get your hands on. 14 to 16mm lenses on a full frame, or 10 to 12mm lenses on a crop sensor. The larger your sensor, the narrower aperture you can get away with, but in general, you want something 2.8 or faster. As mentioned, you can use longer lenses, but you'll have to keep in mind how this affects your shutter speed, because the Earth is constantly rotating, and too long a shutter speed on too long a focal length leads to streaky, blurry stars. The general rule is to divide 500 by your focal length, keeping in mind crop factors for smaller sensors, and that will give you a streak-free shutter speed. Additionally, I would personally subtract 5 seconds from that number, because occasionally stars along the horizon will still streak. In Milky Way photography, your ISO will often be in the low 4 digits, from 2400 to 6400, keeping in mind that the higher the ISO, the more noise to deal with in post. This is why it is recommended for beginners to start with a wide-angle lens, because there is less chance of making the shutter speed too long or missing a composition. Trial and error will be the best teacher of figuring out the camera settings for your particular camera and lens combo, so be ready to sacrifice some nights. A common question that also arises is where to focus. For best results, you want to pick a star in the center of the composition, and using your camera's zoom focus feature to get it tack sharp. With manual lenses, this is usually just a touch behind the infinity focus mark. Once you have single-shot compositions down, you can practice pano photos with longer lenses, which will give you higher resolution images, but at the expense of the ability to take multiple exposures of the same angle to reduce noise. This is where having high-end gear is key. Let's go to Chris on location at Crater Lake for tips.
Once you feel you have the hang of single-shot stacking Milky Way photography, you can go ahead and try more creative things like panos. For pano Milky Way photography, you're going to need fast glass, something like 1.4, 1.8, because you want a quick shutter speed and have minimal amount of time between shifting and reframing your shot. Typically, your panos will be vertical panos, so you'll start at the bottom of your composition and then take shots that overlap at least by a third upwards. What you'll notice when you shoot pano astrophotography is that you won't be able to take the 7 stacked images that you would normally do for a single shot. But there's just a little bit more to deal with in post as far as noise reduction, because if you were to take 7 shots per every angle of the pano, the Milky Way would shift too much and it would align in a very strange way, and Photoshop or Lightroom, they wouldn't know how to deal with it.
Now that you've mastered the Milky Way shot, you'll notice that the best photos out there feature unique compositions and foreground images. Simple shots of the Milky Way over dark or boring landscapes become less interesting, and it's important to keep in mind the classic rules of composition. Your challenge here will be at first finding interesting foregrounds and then how to light them. If your foreground object is close, you can easily take a separately focused and light painted shot and composite it together in post. The problem arises when you're shooting large expansive landscapes that are impossible to light paint. Here, common practice is to either arrive just after sunset or stay until just before sunrise and shoot a blue hour shot of the same Milky Way composition and composite that in post. In part 2 of this tutorial, I'll walk you through a few examples of how to combine your Milky Way exposures in Sequator and edit them whether on a light painted background or a blue hour shot in Photoshop and Lightroom. I hope you learned something from this tutorial. Feel free to leave any comments or questions in the section below, and remember to like and subscribe for more photography tutorials and travel content.